Hello again, welcome to week 2. This week we're going to be talking, if you look at slide 2, about the period between 1911 and 1937. The lecture's in 2 parts. I don't know how many audios I'll do, maybe 3 or 4. I hope I'll be able to keep them to a minimum. In that spirit, let's go on to slide 3. Here I've listed some of the different spellings you'll see for the same things throughout your readings. If you want to talk about this offline, I'd be happy to, but suffice it to say that you'll see these different spellings in different readings because different people have different preferences. It's an unfortunate thing, but it is what it is. The latest system is on the right as you read from left to right. The earliest is on the left. And this latest system is called Pinyin, spelled P-I-N-Y-I-N. That's P-I-N-Y-I-N, Pinyin. And it was designed to help Russians learn Chinese. So there you are. Slide 4. Another source of confusion, if you haven't spent years and years trying to understand all this stuff, are the different names that are preferred by different people for the different phases of the long Chinese Revolution. Now John King Fairbank, the doyen of Sino studies in the United States, of China studies in the United States, once wrote a book called The Great Chinese Revolution, 1800 to 1985, and it's old, but it's pretty good. That's the Great Chinese Revolution. But different authors will give different names to these different revolutions, and I'm not going to read them all to you. That would be silly. And to the different wars, but I'd like you to have this as reference so you can look back at it as you go through the readings and as we make references to them in the lectures. Go on to slide 5. So a very important element to all this is the way the outside powers, in particular the French and the British and the Soviets, affected events. And one of the major elements of this was how the British and French entered into China as enemies, more or less, because in the early part of the 19th century they were enemies, so they were competitors as they entered Asia, and you can see on this map who was who and who was where. But as the 19th century went on, the British and the French became more friendly. They began to align first in China, in my opinion, to maintain stability with, as we discussed last week, to maintain stability in the country by supporting the Qing after 1860. And this meant that they now shared a major interest, and that interest could be promoted by cooperation. There was another more significant event to them, which was the rise of Germany and the outbreak of World War I that cemented them as allies, even though, of course, they don't particularly like each other very much. But they became allies during the early 19th century, and it was also during this period, of course, right after World War I, that the Bolsheviks won the Russian Revolution, and all of a sudden they have a common enemy. And this Russian Revolution also becomes the common enemy of the Americans. As that goes on, the Communist International, which we'll talk about in a bit, was formed and began to foster or foment revolution, or revolutionary activity anyway, all over Asia, because they saw, the decision makers in Moscow saw Asia as a center of colonial activity by the great powers, which they wanted to oppose. So this meant that they had their operatives all over Asia, That meant that their operatives were all over the Asian colonies and were working against colonialism, and that meant that eventually the colonial powers realized that they had a common interest in hunting down communists. And that meant, as we're sort of looking forward here, but that meant that eventually the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, worked with the foreign powers against the Chinese communists in Shanghai and in other urban concessions throughout China. So it's a very interesting series of events. Just to keep in mind, it's a dynamic that operated historically as we go through this period. Let's go on now to slide 6. And the 1911 revolution. Last week we looked at how the Qing was in decline, how only gradually did the all-powerful Empress Cixi realize that her administration had to change, or else her government would fall, and she was too late about that. And so there were a series of revolts. They were a surprise, really, to everybody. The Qing still had a power structure in place, and as we've read, was able to put down different uprisings at different places and different times in the last 4 decades of its rule. A lot of people like to compare that period with China today and point out that the Chinese Communist Party is also putting down all sorts of rebellions practically every day. But there are probably only parallels on the surface there. Not many people anyway, are predicting the imminent end of the Chinese Communist Party. But to get back to the main point, there was a garrison in Wuhan in central China that suddenly found itself forced to choose sides between the empire and a rebellion that broke out in their neighborhood, and they chose to side with the rebellion. Gradually, the different provinces chose sides, and it wasn't as if the whole country rose up against the Qing at once. This really took several years. And eventually, the Qing government was completely dethroned. The emperor abdicated about 6 months after the first rebellion, but there was fighting that continued throughout the country for several years. In some places, there was chaos. In other places, local warlords immediately took power. Now, many of these, the interesting part about this is that many of these warlords were sworn to loyalty to Yuan Shikai. And Yuan Shikai is a very interesting man. Let's just go on to the next slide and talk about him. Yuan Shikai was a good general. He was a canny administrator as well. He had been in Korea as the Qing representative there, and not as head of the Korean government by any means, but as the head representative, the equivalent of an ambassador, but an ambassador plus, sort of like the character Bremer, who was in charge of the U.S. administration of Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Bremer was he was a State Department employee. He was not an ambassador as such, but he was there to administer the country. Yuan Shikai wasn't quite that way in Korea, but he was representing the suzerain power in the region, to which the Korean government had to answer in its foreign relations. So he was a very good administrator in that role during that time. He managed to leave Korea before the Sino-Japanese War began, which meant that he escaped any accountability on that score, and it caused many people in leadership positions to wish that he had stayed there. If only Yuan Shikai had been in charge, maybe things would have been different with Japan. That's, of course, one of those things you can never know. But he had built a loyalty network up through that time, and he continued to do so that he was probably the most influential military man in the Qing when the revolution occurred, and that meant that he was in the best position to be a uniting figure amongst military men. And that meant everything in the chaotic context of the 1911 revolution. So there were attempts, Sun Yat-sen, who we'll get to in a minute, returned to China to try to lead the revolution, and indeed, in terms of popular support, he had more popular support than Yuan Shikai. But as often happens in human history, the people with the gun and the gold make the rules. You can call that the golden gun rule if you want. I don't know. And the real power ended up in Yuan Shikai's hands. He declared himself emperor in 1913, thereby putting an end to the brief reign of the Republic of China as such. Although nowadays the Republic of China is seen by historians and by people on Taiwan, for example, as having begun in 1911. Still, it was interrupted. Republic interrupted. It was interrupted in 1913. The Japanese, in the meantime, were quite active. They had a more powerful military. They had the most powerful military on the ground in some areas of China, a few areas anyway, and they were able to try to force the Chinese government into giving control to Japan of all of their ports. Now, what happened here, again, was like another interruption. Up until this point, in the late 19th century, the British were controlling Chinese ports and were controlling the levy of customs duties, and they were collecting it and then turning over some of it to the Qing government and keeping some of it for themselves. Foreigners collecting taxes in Chinese ports, in essence. And the Japanese wanted in on this, and they, during this time, during the first 15 years of the 20th century, they were becoming more militarily powerful in some places than were the British. The British were the preeminent power in the region during this time. And so when they came up with their demands, they were stymied by the West, and they had to back down. But in the midst of all this difficulty and confusion, Yuan Shikai died. And Yuan Shikai, unfortunately for the Chinese, was the only uniting figure there was. He was the only person, as Chiang Kai-shek would later be the only person, who was able to reassure foreign powers of an ability to maintain stability, and he was the only person who could unite these different military men who controlled their own fiefdoms. So that meant that China dissolved into its warlord period that on the history books goes between 1916 and 1926. Let's go on to slide 8. So the Japanese, again, issued their 21 demands to establish a protectorate over China, in essence, because as what was going on at this time, World War I was going on at this time. So where was the attention of the British and the French? It wasn't in China, it was in Europe. And so the Japanese saw an opportunity. However, they didn't quite get there. Now, in 1919, the Versailles Peace Conference, Versailles followed, and then the Paris Peace Conference came about, and although at least one major statesman Woodrow Wilson of the United States wanted to give back all of the German concessions that they had in China and give them back to the Chinese. Japan was not interested in that sort of solution. They wanted to reap the spoils of the Germans because they had officially, anyway, been on the side of the Allies in World War I. The European powers had a much more solid stake in China than the Americans did. The Americans had their big colony in the Philippines, but they were not settled as colonists on the Chinese mainland, really. And so the Americans were less interested in satisfying the Japanese. However, the British and the French knew that they had to do something to reach a modus vivendi with Japan, and so they decided to give them some, not all, of their demands related to the German colonies in China. And so that happened, and there were massive demonstrations throughout China. In particular, there were demonstrations in Peking, in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square. And this is briefly noted with gunfire in the background in the movie The Last Emperor. I think you probably know which scene I'm talking about. Going on to slide 9. We can start talking about some particular people now. Sun Yatsen, or Sun Zhongshan, known by several names actually, is considered nowadays, at least in Taiwan, to be the father of the nation, and there's some recognition of that role on the mainland as well. You'll actually see on Chinese National Day, you will see Sun Yat-sen's gigantic portrait put up in Tiananmen Square along with that of Mao Zedong. He had been educated in the United States and China and practiced as a medical doctor in Hawaii, but all this time he was very active in anti-Manchu organizing. You'll find, if you ever go to places where he lived, you'll find museums set up in his honor. There's one in Honolulu. There's one in Penang, Malaysia, where he lived and organized amongst the Chinese community there, very extensive Chinese community there, against the Manchus. And so he was all over the place doing this. He was once kidnapped by the Chinese Qing government in London and imprisoned in the embassy there, and he was almost killed. And it was only because a English maid who worked there agreed to smuggle a note out to one of his friends who was in the newspaper business that Sun Yat-sen managed to escape. The police came by and demanded that they turn this man back over to them, and the Qing had to give him up, which I suppose is a lesson. Nowadays, you won't see any foreign workers in any Chinese embassy. Everything that's done from the ambassador's office down to changing the light bulbs is done by a Chinese national in Chinese embassies nowadays, unlike American embassies overseas, which take a much different stance. You'll find just as many Chinese employees working in the American embassy Beijing as you find American employees, which is what it is. So he returned to China, as we were saying a moment ago, when the Xinhai Revolution began in 1911. Eventually he decided that because the Western powers were not interested in helping him, that the only form of assistance he could obtain was from the Soviets, and he chose that route and died early. Died in, I think it was March 1925 in Beijing when he traveled up there for a peace conference. He's often compared badly to Lenin, but only because he was the original leader around which everybody unified, and he died early, and he was followed by somebody considered to be more authoritarian. There's really no other parallel at all. We'll stop here and go on to slide 10.